There is an old saying among the Prairie people: the one who chases glory the loudest is always the last to find it. Long before the highways cut through the red earth, before the cities swallowed the horizon whole, there lived a creature who believed the world owed him a performance. He was clever, yes. He was bold, certainly. But cleverness without patience is only fire without kindling, and bold without wisdom is only noise pretending to be thunder. Tonight, let the old wind carry you back to the age when animals still spoke, when the tall grass held secrets, and when one very hungry, very foolish coyote stumbled into the strangest lesson the prairie ever had to teach. The afternoon sun hung low and heavy over the dusty prairie, painting the world in long stripes of amber and rust. A lean, tawny shape moved along the dry earth, his tail dragging a lazy arc in the dust behind him. This was Coyote, as everyone from the river bend to the cedar grove already knew. And he was moving at that particular pace that fell somewhere between a saunter and a slouch. His ribs were not quite showing, but they were making a very convincing argument. The hunger inside him was not a clean, sharp thing like the edge of a blade. It was slow and enormous, like a river rock sitting in the center of his belly, warm and immovable, and deeply inconvenient. He spoke to the wind the way some creatures speak to the sky, expecting no answer, offering no particular gratitude. He told it that the afternoon was too long, that the prairie offered nothing worth eating, and that any self-respecting landscape ought to keep a few rabbits visible at all times, as a courtesy to distinguished travelers. The wind, as it always did with Coyote, said nothing and went where it pleased. He kicked at a pebble. He watched it skitter into a dry clump of sage. He sighed, long and theatrical, the kind of sigh that hopes someone nearby might hear it and feel appropriately sorry. No one did. The grasshoppers continued their indifferent chorus. A hawk circled far above, searching for something far more interesting than a sulking coyote. And so he walked on, his nose sweeping the warm air for anything that might mean a meal, or, failing that, at least a distraction worthy of his considerable attention. It came to him first as a feeling in his ears, a subtle pressure beneath the hum of the afternoon, like a note played on an instrument too small to name. He slowed. His nostrils widened. The sound was rhythmic and low, and it rose and fell the way a good story rises and falls, with a shape to it, a kind of intention that ordinary wind and ordinary crickets simply do not possess. Something ahead was making music, and music, Coyote had always believed, was the first sign that something interesting was happening to someone who was not him. He moved more carefully now, his earlier sluggishness forgotten entirely the moment curiosity arrived to replace it. He eased himself behind a sprawling wild berry bush, the kind that grows thick and dark along the soft bank of a forgotten stream, and he parted the branches with one careful paw. What he saw stopped every thought in his skull like a stone dropped into still water. There were hundreds of them, fat, iridescent marsh flies, their bodies catching the slanted light like tiny pieces of dropped sky, standing in perfect concentric rings on a wide, smooth stone at the water's edge. They were joined at the legs, spinning slowly at first, then faster, a wheel turning inside a wheel, each circle moving in the direction opposite to the one surrounding it. And they were singing, not the way insects sing in the dry grass, all friction and accident, but in deliberate, rounded tones that wove together into something ancient and complete. Coyote's mouth opened, his ears tilted forward. For a single, rare moment, he forgot entirely about his hunger. But that moment, like all of Coyote's quieter moments, did not last long. Because there is a particular kind of joy that certain creatures cannot simply witness. They must possess it, wear it, stand in the center of it, and be seen standing there. Coyote watched the flies spin and felt something take root in his chest that was not admiration, though it wore admiration's clothes. It was the old familiar ache of wanting what others have. The sense that any celebration he is not leading is a celebration that has somehow made a terrible mistake. He could feel it move through him like heat rising off the summer stone, restless and insistent and entirely convinced of its own importance. He stepped out from behind the berry bush. He rolled his shoulders. He thumped one paw against his chest with the authority of an animal who has decided the world requires his entrance. The singing faltered. Hundreds of small, glittering eyes turned to regard him. He threw his arms wide and grinned the grin that had preceded at least a dozen disasters in his long and complicated history. He told them they were a fine group, yes, very energetic, certainly committed to whatever it was they were doing. But he had arrived now, and the real entertainment could begin. He told them he wanted the dance. He wanted every step, every turn, every note of that rhythm that had somehow managed to exist in the world without him at its center. He told them a creature of his grace, his instinct, his undeniable presence, was clearly the one the dance had been waiting for all along. The flies were quiet for a breath. Then, from the very center of the inner ring, a small figure detached itself from the others and faced him. The chief of the flies was no larger than a thumbnail, with wings like scraps of morning cloud and eyes the color of still water. She hovered at eye level with Coyote, which required a certain confidence, and she wore that confidence the way a mountain wears snow, without effort, without announcement. She was not fooled. She had lived long enough beside the river to know what Coyote's grin meant, to understand the shape of the hunger behind it, and to recognize that what stood before her was not a student seeking wisdom, but a thief seeking something he could not carry. The flies did not whisper among themselves. They did not need to. The knowledge passed between them the way warmth passes through a single woven blanket, shared and immediate, and already decided. She bowed her head once, slowly, a gesture that Coyote immediately took as a sign of appropriate reverence. She told him the dance was sacred, yes. She told him it was old, older than the cedar trees, older than the first snow. She told him that it could not simply be watched and copied the way a magpie mimics a hawk. She told him the rhythm lived not in the feet, but in the bones, and it would only enter the bones of one who had first proven something rare and difficult, and very inconvenient for someone of Coyote's particular temperament. She called it the ultimate test of stillness. Coyote's ears swiveled forward. His eyes narrowed with the pleasure of an animal who believes he has already won. The instructions were delivered with great ceremony. Coyote was to walk into the river where the bank mud ran thick and dark and cool. The kind of mud that holds the shape of everything pressed into it and refuses to let go easily. He was to submerge himself fully, coating every inch of fur from the tip of his long nose to the last strand of his tail. Then he was to climb out of the river, cross to the broad, flat rock that jutted over the water like a shelf the prairie had left behind by mistake, and stand there in the full authority of the afternoon sun, without moving. Not a twitch, not a blink, not the faintest tremor of a whisker. He was to remain in this state for 1 full hour, the chief explained, until the sun had done its work, and the mud had become something more than mud, something like a second skin, tight and fixed, and entirely his own. Only then, she said, only after he had proven that his body could be still enough to hear a thing beyond the reach of ordinary attention, would the rhythm enter him and make itself at home in the chambers of his bones. Coyote listened to all of this with the expression of an animal absorbing information he considers beneath him, but is willing to endure for the sake of the eventual reward. He asked no questions. He did not wonder why the test involved mud. He was already imagining the moment he emerged from it, already rehearsing the casual way he would mention to the elk and the ravens that he had, of course, mastered the sacred dance of the marsh flies, as one does. The mud was colder than he expected, and heavier than seemed reasonable, and it clung to every part of him with a thoroughness he might have appreciated under different circumstances. He emerged from the river changed in appearance, if not in character, a lumpy brown shape that moved toward the flat rock with the dignity of an animal who has decided dignity is a thing you carry inside, regardless of what is happening to the outside. He took his position on the stone. The sun, which had been merely warm before, became purposeful the moment he stopped moving, pressing down on the river mud with an attention that felt almost personal. He felt it begin almost immediately, the subtle shift from wet to tacky, from tacky to taut, the mud drawing itself tighter against his skin as it dried. And then it started, not in one place, but everywhere and nowhere, traveling across his body like a slow whisper that keeps finding new things to say. It started behind his left ear, moved to the base of his tail, crept forward along the ridge of his spine, settled with devastating patience on the very tip of his nose, and then, having decided no location was truly off limits, began visiting all of them in rapid rotation. Every instinct he had ever owned rose up in unanimous agreement that something must be done about this immediately. He held. His face said everything his body was not permitted to say, twisting through expressions that had no names, each one more eloquent than the last, a whole dictionary of suffering written in the language of tightly held muscle and desperate will. The flies had not gone anywhere. They had settled into the grass and the berry bushes and the low branches of the willow tree that leaned over the bank like an old relative listening in on a private conversation. They watched him with the patient interest of those who already know the ending. And when they were satisfied that Coyote was truly committed, truly frozen in his ridiculous determination. Truly as helpless as the mud-covered stone he was pretending to be. The chief gave the signal. They rose together, a shimmering cloud moving with collective purpose toward the flat rock. And they landed. Not all at once, but in waves, each wave finding some new whisker or wrinkle of dried mud to treat as a stage. They moved their feet with quick, deliberate precision. A rapid, irreverent rhythm performed directly on the surface of his sealed face. It began at the left whisker and moved toward the right with the enthusiasm of something that has been waiting all afternoon for exactly this opportunity. Coyote's eyes went enormous. They revolved slowly, searching for an escape route that the rules of the test refused to permit. His ears, no longer bound by the dried mud around them, betrayed him completely, twitching with a wild, involuntary energy that communicated everything his frozen face was trying to conceal. Inside the vault of his skull, every thought was a variation on the same desperate bargain, promising himself that the dance, when it came, would be worth this, that the glory waiting on the other side of this hour was large enough to justify every unbearable second of the getting there. The hour, which had lasted approximately 3 lifetimes, finally ended. The chief of the flies rose from his nose and hovered before his face, and announced in a voice that carried more laughter than ceremony that he had passed the test. She said the music was ready to take him, that the rhythm was loose in the world, and all he had to do was let his body follow it wherever it led. Coyote's self-restraint, which had been holding together with the structural integrity of old rope over a fast river, gave way entirely. The sound that came out of him was enormous and shapeless and full of relief and hunger and 4 kinds of wanting all at once. He launched himself off the rock with an energy that the afternoon had not previously suspected he contained. He spun. He jumped. He shook himself the way a storm shakes a young tree, from the ground up and all at once. And the dried river mud, which had been so patient and so thorough in its torment, finally met its end. It left him in large, satisfying pieces, flung outward with the centrifugal ambition of something that had been waiting for exactly this release, striking the trunks of nearby cottonwoods, sailing into the berry bushes, disappearing into the tall grass with a series of small, emphatic sounds. He danced for a full hour, maybe more. The prairie light changed around him from afternoon gold to the deep, bruised pink of early evening. He did not notice. He was too busy being, at last, magnificently, publicly, irresistibly, in motion. He stopped when his legs stopped for him, folding beneath him with the honest exhaustion of muscles that have been asked to perform more than they had agreed to in the morning. He sat in the cooling grass and breathed and waited for the feeling of triumph to arrange itself properly across his face. It came, briefly. He had done it. He had endured the mud, survived the itch, outlasted the flies, and danced with everything he had. He was a creature of the sacred rhythm now, a student graduated into something larger than himself, and he intended to let everyone from the river bend to the cedar grove know it before the stars came out. He stood. He prepared himself for the walk home, the kind of walk that is really a procession, slow and visible and full of meaning. He lifted one foot to begin the dance again, the way a singer draws breath before the opening note, confident and complete. And then he noticed the silence inside him where the song should have been. He waited, expecting it to arrive the way water arrives when you tip a vessel, inevitable, obedient, his by right. Nothing came. He tried the steps again, this time from memory, this time with great concentration, working backward through the afternoon to find the place where the music had entered him. He found, in that place, nothing but the itch. He found the rock, the mud, the flies on his nose. He found his eyes rolling in their sockets and his ears twitching against his will. He had been so entirely consumed by the battle to keep still, so utterly occupied by the war inside his own body, that the music had played all around him, and he had never, not for a single moment, actually listened. He looked toward the flat rock. He looked toward the berry bushes, the willow tree, the grassy bank where hundreds of witnesses had settled to watch. The flies were gone. They had slipped away into the falling evening while he was dancing his hour away, dissolved into the soft dark the way smoke dissolves into open sky, leaving nothing behind but the absence of themselves, and a feeling that something very old had just been very amused. He stood alone on the edge of the river as the first stars arrived, one by one, like an audience taking their seats for a show that had already ended. He tried to recreate the dance, to reconstruct the rhythm from the pieces of it his body had absorbed through sheer proximity. What emerged was something that bore only the vaguest relationship to what he had witnessed behind the berry bush. A frantic, unmoored series of movements that looked, to the pair of young rabbits watching from the tall grass, like a dog engaged in urgent personal business with his own tail. The rabbits said nothing. They were polite, but their ears were tilted toward each other in a way that communicated something Coyote would not have enjoyed hearing. He stopped. He sat down in the failing light. He considered the long afternoon and all its investments: the mud, the stone, the itch, the hour of dancing, the walk home that now had no procession in it. Somewhere behind him, in the deepest blue of the summer evening, a meadowlark sang one clean note, clear and whole and entirely unbothered. A song that required no audience and no approval. A song that was simply and completely itself. And then the old storyteller, who had been watching all of this from the beginning, let the firelight settle and said what the story had been saying all along: that greed and vanity will only make you dance to a song you cannot hear. Tonight, Coyote taught us more by failing than 100 wise teachers could manage by succeeding. He showed us that the loudest desire in the room is rarely the deepest one, and that when we want something only to be seen wanting it, we have already lost the thing itself. True listening, whether of music, of another person, or of the quieter instructions life leaves along the path, requires us to still something inside, not just the body, but the voice that is always composing its own applause. Coyote could not hear the song because he was too busy auditioning for it. The mud did not teach him stillness. It only showed him he did not yet know what stillness was for. If this old story found its way into you tonight, leave a word for the storyteller in the comments below. And if you carry it with you when you go, consider sharing it with someone who might need its quiet company. For those who wish to hear these tales uninterrupted, without the noise of the modern world slipping in between the sentences, you can find the full collection ad-free on Patreon and on Spotify, where the firelight is always on, and the night is always long enough for one more story.